John Wick returns home after a long day at work when he hears a strange cry coming from the alley. When he gets closer, he discovers that it is a small, injured cat. He decides to... There was a time when the name John Wick stirred fear in every shadowed alley and marble-floored hall of the criminal underworld. A name whispered in fear, a spectre, a force of unstoppable violence wrapped in a tailored black suit. But that man, or whatever was left of him, had long since vanished into the folds of memory and myth. What remained was just a man, tired, frayed at the edges, hollowed out by loss, and exhausted from the weight of a life carved out with bullets and blood. John had disappeared from the world that once demanded his wrath. He had retreated to the edge of nowhere, settling in a creaking log cabin nestled deep within the pines of northern Canada, where the trees stood tall like silent sentinels, and the snow fell thick enough to muffle even the memory of violence. Here, time did not march, it drifted. The air was thin, the days were quiet, and the only sound that greeted him each morning was the whistle of wind slipping through cracked windows and the groan of timber settling into the earth. His life had become a series of small rituals: brewing bitter, black coffee in an old tin kettle, stacking firewood with methodical precision, sitting for hours on the porch watching mist roll between the trees like forgotten spirits. He didn't speak unless necessary, and even then, his voice sounded foreign to him, rough, rusted from disuse. There were no visitors, no calls, no debts to be collected or owed. The phone had long been disconnected, the weapons buried beneath the floorboards, and the suit stored in a trunk he hadn't opened in years. John had left it all behind. The death, the deals, the darkness. He didn't need anyone anymore. And perhaps more importantly, he no longer believed anyone needed him. It was on a morning like any other, when the first snow of the season had begun to fall in lazy spirals, dusting the porch and the pines in a pale hush, that something shifted. John had risen early, stirred by a dream he couldn't quite recall but which left a familiar hollowness in his chest. As he opened the front door to retrieve the chopped wood left the night before, he paused. And there it was. At first he thought it was a patch of snow discolored by leaves, or perhaps a pile of bark blown in by the wind. But then it moved. Barely, and he saw it for what it was. A small, shivering creature curled tightly into itself, fur matted with frost, ribs visible beneath its frail frame. A cat. Or more precisely, what used to be a cat. It looked more like a survivor now, battered by the world, clinging to warmth, eyes closed in a desperate attempt to shut out the cold. John stared at it for a long while, unmoving, caught in a moment that seemed both alien and all too familiar. Something in the way the creature trembled stirred a memory. Not clear, but powerful. A different kind of pain, older than bullets or revenge. Gently, almost without realizing it, he stepped forward and knelt beside it. His hand hovered before making contact, uncertain of whether to touch it, afraid it might shatter like ice under his palm. It opened one eye, a sliver of amber peeking through frost and fear, and in that gaze, brief as it was, John saw something impossible. Not recognition, not even trust, but a fragile, shared ache. As if the cat too had once belonged to someone, had once had something worth holding on to, and had lost it. He didn't speak, he just scooped it into his arms, held it close to his chest, and felt its tiny heart flutter like a dying star against his ribs. That morning, in the silence of the forest, something shifted, and though John Wick had once turned his back on the world, he realized, perhaps too late, perhaps just in time, that the world hadn't quite turned its back on him. The cat was impossibly light in his arms, little more than bone and breath, yet John cradled it with a care that would have once watched him dispatch enemies with the elegance of a bullet dancing through air. He laid it gently on the worn rug beside the fireplace, wrapped it in one of his old flannel shirts, and stoked the flames until the entire room glowed with the kind of warmth he hadn't felt in years. The front paw was injured, swollen, raw, and crusted with dried blood, and though John had once sutured his own wounds in hotel bathrooms, pulled bullets from his flesh with trembling fingers, and reset broken ribs with a growl and a bottle of whiskey, he now found himself awkwardly fumbling through the quiet task of tending to a creature so small it barely filled his two hands. He moved slowly, cautiously, as though afraid that the cat might vanish if he blinked. And when he finally finished cleaning the wound, wrapping it in gauze with the tenderness of someone who had once lost everything he loved, the cat let out a soft, rasping purr that startled him more than any gunshot ever had. For the first 2 days it hardly moved. It slept curled near the hearth, rising only to drink water or eat a few cautious bites of the canned tuna John had scrounged from the back of his pantry. He didn't name it at first, didn't dare, because naming something meant it belonged, and John had convinced himself that he no longer wanted to belong to anything or anyone. But the cat followed him wherever he went, even limping slowly behind him as he chopped firewood or stepped out to check the perimeter of the cabin, always watching him with those strange amber eyes that seemed less afraid of him than curious, as if trying to decipher the ghost inside the man. On the third morning, John opened the door to find snow falling in heavy silence. He turned back to find the cat sitting by his boot, its head tilted slightly, tail flicking in idle rhythm. Something about its presence, quiet, constant, unassuming, felt eerily familiar, and so he said it aloud for the first time, barely a whisper. Shadow. The cat didn't react, but the name felt right, fitting like an old glove, because it moved like a shadow, appeared without sound and clung to him as if it were the last warm spot in a world slowly freezing over. In a life filled with things he couldn't control, Shadow was a gentle presence that simply stayed. John Wick, the man once feared by kings and killers, now found himself waking early not to prepare for death, but to warm water for a cat's bath. And when he caught himself chuckling, actually laughing after discovering Shadow curled snugly inside his old boot, he didn't stop himself. It had been so long since he felt anything close to human, and somehow Shadow made the silence feel a little less empty. Peace, John had come to learn, was not something that lasted. It wasn't built to. It was fragile, fleeting, more like a breath held in the stillness than a state of being, and he should have known better than to believe he could hold onto it for long. The quiet life he had constructed, piece by tentative piece, in the cold shadows of the pines, had always been borrowed time. And time, especially for men like him, always came with a debt. It was a morning like any other, chilled and grey, with the sky still heavy from last night's snow. John had run out of supplies, the usual, food, medicine, a new bag of litter, and decided to make the trip into the nearest town, a 2-hour drive down narrow roads winding through frozen wilderness. He had left Shadow curled up by the fire, his injured paw nearly healed, his breathing steady and slow, and though John hesitated at the door, some instinct tugging at the edges of his gut, he convinced himself that things were fine, that this was just another day in a life that was finally learning to be ordinary. He returned just after dusk, headlights cutting through the darkness, tires crunching over fresh snow that had already begun to reclaim the rutted trail leading home. But as the cabin came into view, or rather as its absence struck him, his heart froze before his hands could even reach for the brakes. Where his home had once stood was now a smouldering skeleton, blackened timber and curling smoke twisting into the night sky like the last breath of a dying promise. The porch had collapsed, the roof gone, and the flames had licked their way through everything, the bed, the books, the framed photograph of Helen he had never dared hang on the wall but kept tucked in a drawer, and worse, so much worse, Shadow. He ran before the car had even fully stopped, stumbling through ash and embers, eyes darting in every direction for a flicker of movement, an echo of that small, familiar presence. There was nothing. No cry, no paw prints, just silence and ruin and the unbearable weight of loss pressing hard against his ribs. And then he saw it, carved crudely into what remained of the front steps, seared into the wood with fire or blade, a symbol he had hoped to never see again. It was old and simple, a circle broken through the middle, but to John Wick it may as well have been a declaration of war. It was the mark of the order he had left behind, the nameless cabal that operated beneath the high table, older and darker, far more intimate. They didn't work for money. They didn't kill for sport. They existed for secrets. And John had kept one, a secret they thought buried, but that had lived just beneath his floorboards all this time, wrapped in steel and silence. They hadn't come for vengeance, nor to reclaim him. They had come for the thing he had sworn to forget, the weight he had carried like a curse, and Shadow, small and innocent and utterly unaware, had been taken not for leverage in the traditional sense, but as bait, a knife twisted where it would cut deepest, not into his flesh, but into whatever remained of the man inside him. Standing in the ruins with the snow falling softly over ash and charred memories, John Wick understood that the past had finally caught up to him. The fire was not only in the wood and bone of his cabin, but rekindled deep within his chest, an old, smouldering heat he had tried so hard to bury. And this time it wasn't about revenge. It was about something far more dangerous. Love. It had been over 3 years since John Wick had touched the black suit, the one tailored to perfection, sleek and somber, like a shroud stitched for a funeral he had once promised to never attend again. But that morning, as the sky turned a deep steel grey and the last of the ashes from his home cooled under fresh snow, he opened the old chest beneath the floorboards and pulled the fabric out with a strange, quiet finality. It still fit, as if time itself had been waiting for this moment. He stood before the cracked mirror, knotting the tie with steady hands, not out of vanity or nostalgia, but because this was the language they understood, the armor of the man they thought they had broken. His hair was longer now, streaked with grey, and his eyes carried not the fire of rage, but the dim, steady burn of purpose. He wasn't returning to that world because of a vendetta or a blood oath. He was doing it for something that no one had ever thought would be his weakness. Love. Plain and simple, pure and undiluted, directed not at vengeance or justice, but at a creature who had brought him back from the brink of emotional extinction. John moved like a ghost through the underworld, not hiding, for there was no point, but hunting, and those who saw him quickly realized that the Baba Yaga they had feared was not a myth after all. He asked no questions. He simply followed trails, a whispered name in a dive bar, a trembling informant in the back of a butcher's shop, a terrified gunman in a snow-covered alley who dropped his weapon the moment John stepped into view. Blood returned to his hands not as a badge of honor, but as a consequence, a necessary evil on the path to the only thing he cared about. The clues led him through cities he had sworn never to revisit, past gravestones of friends and enemies alike, until finally, in the rusted outskirts of a forgotten industrial town, he found it. A warehouse, sagging and crooked under the weight of time and secrets, far from the polished violence of the Continental or the gilded corridors of the High Table. It was there, in the dim light filtering through broken panes, that he heard it. The soft, pitiful mewl of a creature in pain, faint and fading, but unmistakable. Shadow. He moved swiftly but silently, bypassing the handful of guards with a precision that bordered on inhuman, and when he reached the back of the warehouse, he saw it. A small cage, wedged between crates, its metal bars bent from desperation. Inside, the cat was a shadow of its former self, thinner, dirtier, eyes wide with fear and hunger. John's breath caught for a moment, a crack in his armor. But he said nothing. He knelt, unlatched the cage, and gently lifted the frail body into his arms. Shadow didn't hiss, didn't struggle. He simply leaned in, weakly nudging John's neck, a tremble passing through his body like a sigh finally released. John stood, holding him close, shielding him from the cold, from the cruelty, from everything. Then, without turning, he spoke, his voice calm, low and heavy with something far colder than anger. "You shouldn't have touched the cat." The silence that followed was short-lived. It began with the sound of metal sliding, magazines locking, safeties clicking off, but it ended in chaos. John moved like memory, like instinct honed by grief and sharpened by purpose, each shot deliberate, each step part of a choreography known only to death itself. The gunfire echoed off the walls like thunder in a hollow cave, bodies dropping before their weapons even cleared their holsters. There was no hesitation, no mercy. Not because he had none left to give, but because he couldn't afford the risk of one stray bullet finding what he carried in his arms. When the last shell casing fell, the warehouse stood still again, painted in crimson and silence. John didn't look back. He didn't need to. He walked out into the snow with Shadow still pressed to his chest, and for the first time since his wife died, John Wick felt something that almost resembled clarity. They had taken everything from him once. This time, he had something to hold on to, and God help the next fool who tried to take it away. Shadow survived, though the injury to his front leg left a permanent limp that turned his walk into a slow, deliberate shuffle. A small price, John thought, for a life nearly lost. The vet, a grizzled man with kind eyes who owed John a favor from another life, had done what he could, and while Shadow would never leap the same way again, he still purred with the same contented rumble when curled beside the fire, his body warm against John's side. As for John himself, he survived as well, though not as the man he had once been. The fire that had reignited inside him during those bloody days of pursuit and vengeance had not consumed him, as it had in the past, but had burned just hot enough to clear the debris, to strip him down to something simpler, quieter. He no longer carried the weight of identity like a burden strapped to his back. He was not Baba Yaga anymore, not the myth whispered in back rooms and dark corridors. He was just a man, scarred, weathered, but alive, and for the first time in decades not searching for death or redemption, but simply stillness. He didn't return to the city, didn't answer the quiet inquiries that surfaced like ripples in the underworld after his reappearance. He let the rumors fade, let the silence grow around his name again. Instead, he returned to the forest, not to hide, but to begin anew, not for the world, not even for Shadow, but for himself. The house he rebuilt wasn't large, just a modest cabin tucked a little deeper into the woods, out of sight, out of reach. This time it had more windows. He wanted the light to come in. He built it slowly, piece by piece, sometimes with Shadow watching from a sun-warmed patch of grass, tail flicking lazily, eyes half closed. And when the cabin stood complete, sturdy and warm, John found himself unable to stop there. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps it was gratitude, or perhaps, somewhere beneath the layers of violence and grief, there had always been a sliver of him capable of care. Whatever the reason, he began rescuing them, the strays, the broken, the unwanted. At first it was just a limping dog he found by the riverbank, ribs showing beneath fur, trembling with hunger. Then came a fox with a mangled paw, a litter of abandoned kittens, a squirrel that had fallen from a tree and never quite regained its balance. There was no sign, no website, no news coverage. Just a man in the woods with a gentle touch and steady hands, who spoke little but listened well. He built small shelters, repaired old crates into cozy dens, cooked rice and broth over a wood stove, and patched blankets with threadbare care. The forest around him slowly filled with life, tentative, cautious but real. And Shadow, ever the quiet guardian, was always there, limping beside him, curling beside each new arrival, offering a slow blink of trust that spoke louder than any welcome. In the quiet of the nights, as the fire crackled softly and the stars wheeled silently overhead, John Wick slept. Not like a fugitive, nor a man haunted by ghosts, but like someone who had finally, however improbably, come home. He did not dream of violence. He did not wake with his heart pounding. He simply slept, with Shadow at his side and the forest wrapped around them like a blanket of second chances.